I'm Jeremy Martin at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I'm going to talk about going through the blend wall or not, and in particular, the impact for advanced and cellulosic biofuels. I'm in the Clean Vehicles program, and in our program, we're working on cutting projected oil use in half over the next 20 years. And we can do this by moving forward with efficiency and innovation across all of our uses of oil. To be a little more specific, that means things like more efficient cars and trucks, but also improving the efficiency of the freight vehicles or the commercial vehicles and of the planes and trains and ships that move our goods all around the world. And there's also opportunities to improve the efficiency of oil that we use in our buildings, homes, and industry. And so when you look at all that, efficiency is definitely the biggest and most important thing that we need to do to reduce oil use. But it's not the only thing we can do, and it's not enough by itself to get us to half the oil. We also need clean, new fuels, innovative new fuels like electricity for vehicles and next generation biofuels, which is the main subject today. And there's also things we can do in our transportation system to reduce oil use as well. So when you put this all together, we can cut projected oil use in half, and in so doing, we can reduce the problems that oil causes to our economy, to our security, to our environment, and to climate. So to make that work, we're going to need more biofuels, a lot more biofuels. And we can't we can't expand biofuels this much with the biofuels that we have now. We're really going to need better biofuels with a reduced impact on the climate and the environment. And in particular, we're going to need to look beyond food as a source of our biofuels. And so that means things like agricultural residues. So these are pictures of corn stover, which is the stalks and leaves of the corn left behind after the grain is harvested. We can also make fuel out of garbage and other waste materials. And probably the biggest long-term potential is in perennial grasses and other energy crops. And when you look at this potential across the nation, our analysis suggests that by 2030, we could produce 677 million dry tons. And that's basically more than enough biomass that's needed to support the goals in our half the oil plan. So there's plenty of this biomass to make biofuel, but we also need facilities to convert it into fuel. And these are the first two commercial facilities that are operating now. One in Mississippi making renewable gasoline and diesel, and another one in Florida making cellulosic ethanol. And there's 3 more of these facilities under construction, 2 in Iowa and 1 in Kansas. And so, that's sort of the landscape. And then this is the policy. And of course, a lot of the conversation about the renewable fuel standard has focused on corn ethanol. And that makes sense because, corn ethanol has grown dramatically over the last 10 years. We've seen more than a 10 billion gallon increase with lots of impacts. But when we look at the future of the renewable fuel standard, the picture is actually quite different. So the role of corn ethanol or conventional biofuel in the future of the renewable fuel standard is quite limited. The contribution is capped at 15 billion gallons, and we already have 15 billion gallons of production capacity built now. And so, the renewable fuel standard isn't about expanding corn ethanol production. Bruce talked about, there's some questions about, how much is used in the U.S., but the really important things about the renewable fuel standard going forward are the advanced biofuels, which are growing, and those are biodiesel and sugarcane ethanol, and especially these cellulosic biofuels, the ones made out of biomass that I discussed earlier. And to meet these ambitious targets that we have for expanding biofuels use, we really need these cellulosic biofuels. But unfortunately, the production of these cellulosic biofuels is behind the schedule laid out by Congress. We can still, the resources are there to make the full target happen, but it's not going to happen in 2022. It's just taking more time than that to scale up this industry. To put it in perspective, if we get kind of solid policy and investments behind this industry, we could get to 36 billion gallons by 2030, but realistically, it's not going to be sooner than that. So what does that all imply for the blend wall, which is the topic of our conversation today? Is it the end of the road for ethanol? So as Bruce described in his presentation, there's an opportunity under the RFS to expand the use of ethanol by the flex fuel vehicles that are already on the road, more than 15 million of them. But there are also many other pathways to expanded biofuels use. For example, there's biodiesel, there are drop-in biofuels, there's butanol, and biogas, just to name a few. Now, for all of these fuels, the Renewable Fuel Standard is the engine of investment in this, in all of these fuels, and the RIN system is really the transmission that links the overall policy, the Renewable Fuel Standard, to the concrete financial incentives that are going to make people decide, whether to make these investments in next generation biofuels or not. And so what we're looking at is really a kind of a competition where these different fuels are like different vehicles that can deliver on the oil savings and climate goals of the RFS. And so up to now, the leader certainly has been E10, where the majority of the biofuel has been used, with biodiesel also playing a significant role. But as we look forward, E85 is poised to play a more significant role in those flex fuel vehicles that are already on the road. And drop-in biofuels also are coming online now. And there's a kind of interesting competitive dynamic between drop-ins and E85, where there's some additional costs associated with distributing E85, incentives for consumers to switch, incentives to make it attractive for gasoline station owners to put in the equipment. And with drop-in biofuels, you don't have any of those obstacles. And so that creates an advantage for drop-in biofuels, an inherent advantage that's worth, a certain amount. And the question is, up to now, drop-in biofuels have been more expensive to produce. And so what we're going to see over the next few years is, whether drop-in biofuels or E85 is the most cost-effective way to deploy additional biofuel beyond E10. So that's going to be an interesting competition to watch. Butanol is another potential source of biofuel going forward. Butanol is an alternative blending component like ethanol, but it can blend essentially twice the renewable content into a gallon of gasoline that ethanol can. Biogas, recently proposed regulations from EPA will allow biogas to be used in the portion of our fleet that runs on natural gas, like some heavy-duty vehicles, and also generating RINs and reducing oil use and greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, there's some interesting potential with intermediate blends like E30, a 30% blend of ethanol and gasoline. And there's the potential to develop cars that would be even more efficient running on E30 than they are running on gasoline. But of course, we can't put those vehicles on the road until we have an infrastructure built out to distribute different blends. And so that's why I think I labeled the car drafting behind E85, because if we can build out infrastructure to distribute higher ethanol blends like E85 to the flex fuel vehicles, then that will also create an opportunity for E30 to come along behind it and expand the use of these blends in a particularly efficient way. So to make progress on the RFS, we need investment. And in order to get investment, that depends on RIN prices both today and the anticipation of RIN prices in the future. And these RIN prices depend on the mandates. And of course, we have very ambitious mandates in the Renewable Fuel Standard. So in theory, we have everything we need to make this system work. But the problem with the theory is that these mandates are currently the roadmap. The RFS roadmap is obsolete. The level of mandates that's described is unrealistic, and that's creating uncertainty, which is delaying investment. And so here's where the mandates were when the regulation was finalized, growing to 36 billion gallons, including 16 billion gallons of cellulosic biofuel by 2022. Up to now, EPA has been pursuing a path of making up for the delays in cellulosic biofuel by replacing it with additional mandates for biodiesel and sugarcane ethanol. But if you look, and that would suggest a rate of growth of the Renewable Fuel Standard stays at about 2 billion gallons a year going forward. But if you look at the implications of that, like how much sugarcane ethanol and biodiesel would be required, it becomes clear that this is quickly becoming untenable. There really isn't enough vegetable oil to make that much biodiesel, or enough sugarcane ethanol to meet Brazil's needs and to see the US expand this much. And so this is really not a plausible scenario either. And a lot of negative consequences could come from pursuing it, as I've described in previous publications. What we've suggested in the Renewable Fuel Standard is to cut projected growth by adjusting all the mandates together with the cellulosic mandate. And in that case, we'd see growth on the order of 600 million gallons a year. And of course, there's a sentiment or in some quarters to just get rid of the Renewable Fuel Standard, to repeal it entirely, or to scale it back through other means. And in that case, if we just stayed with a 10% blend of ethanol and gasoline, we could anticipate seeing biofuel use kind of gradually get reduced as gasoline use is reduced. So in this uncertain climate, it's not surprising that people aren't rushing to make investments in cellulosic biofuel. So the solution is to update the roadmap, and with a more up-to-date roadmap, we could have better outcomes for everybody, for fuel producers and consumers, for people who need to market fuel, for investors who want to make investments in this industry, and for regulators who have the job of setting this trajectory, and of course for a clean fuel future. So just to kind of wrap things up, I would say that crossing this E10 threshold is more like a speed bump than a brick wall. It is appropriate to slow down and proceed with caution, but it's also important to keep moving forward, because what's at stake is cutting our oil use, and that's something that we can do if we move forward with efficiency and innovation across all our uses of oil, and with a big role for these biomass-based biofuels. And we singled out biomass-based biofuels in particular because they're available at large scale and can avoid conflicts with food that our current biofuels have. But to get these biomass-based biofuels to market, we're going to need the Renewable Fuel Standard to keep working. It's a smart policy. It's worth getting it right, but that's going to mean updating the roadmap and in the near term, slowing down and proceeding with caution. So thanks very much.